Hi guys, tonight we're setting off on a quiet journey through flickering candlelight and creaking floorboards, a long walk through time and memory to visit a medieval tavern. But this won't be a quick peek through dusty glass. We're stepping inside, sitting down at the hearth and letting the world unfold slowly, richly around us. Each part of this tale will be like a gentle turn of a worn parchment page. We'll smell the fire smoke, hear the dice clatter, and maybe, if we listen closely enough, catch a secret or two whispered in the low candlelit corners. So take a breath, settle in, let the wind fade from your coat and your shoulders. This is part one. The stew was heavier than it looked. Chunks of carrot, thick strips of mutton, softened by hours over a low flame, and a broth so dark and rich it almost shimmered like oil in the firelight. It was ladled into a rough earthen bowl, its edges worn smooth by time and many hands. The spoon you used was made of wood, the handle thin and curved from use, the bowl stained from years of hot broth and idle chewing between tales. You held it close, letting the warmth rise into your cold-numbed face. It was good, not refined or elegant, but full of root and smoke and something that tasted like home, even if it wasn't your home. The tavern had grown quieter now, the murmur of voices sinking into the floorboards like water into dry earth. The travellers who had stomped in behind you had settled in a far corner, their voices muffled by the thick timber walls and the low ceiling beams. Somewhere above, you heard the faint creak of a floorboard, someone moving about upstairs, likely the innkeeper's daughter fetching linens or some other guest turning in early. You had no such plans. Your eyes wandered the room now that your belly was no longer growling. There was a kind of beauty in the symmetry of the worn imperfections. No two chairs matched, yet they all bore the same signs, a slight wobble here, a splintered edge there. The tables were marked by burn rings and knife scores, not out of malice but necessity. Places where lanterns had been set too hot or knives had sliced bread, or maps. You wondered idly how many secrets had been spoken over these tables, how many coins had clinked into waiting palms. A soft scuffle caught your attention. Near the back wall behind the hearth there was a narrow door, partially ajar. Beyond it, darkness, but not complete. A faint glow danced beyond the threshold, and with it, the subtle scent of herbs, lavender maybe, or crushed rosemary, and something more bitter. Medicinal. No one else in the tavern seemed to notice or care. The innkeeper hadn't returned since bringing your stew. His absence wasn't ominous, it felt ordinary, as though he trusted the space to breathe on its own for a while. You took another sip of ale, feeling its warmth settle into your chest. And then you noticed the man near the hearth again. The one whose hood had been drawn, back turned toward the fire. He hadn't moved since you arrived. His shoulders were hunched, not from cold, but from a kind of weight that didn't come from the weather. A thick mug sat beside him, untouched. His boots, still caked with drying mud, told of travel, but his stillness hinted at something else. Waiting, perhaps, or watching. You watched him for a while, quietly, as your spoon scraped the last of the stew from the bowl. There was something about him that didn't fit neatly into the picture. Not dangerous, just silent in a world that breathed with sound. Outside, the wind had picked up. It howled softly against the eaves and made the shutters rattle. You reached for your mug, now nearly empty. The last swallow of ale was warmer, flatter. You didn't mind. Your body had begun to thaw, slowly, from the inside out. From the corner table, laughter burst suddenly, sharp and unfiltered. One of the dice players, an older man with a craggy voice, had slapped his palm down in triumph, scattering small wooden cubes across the tabletop. The woman beside him leaned forward, grinning, her braid falling over one shoulder like a rope of dark silk. "Luck's a fickle beast," she said, in a voice that carried just enough to be heard. The man with the hood stirred. Not much, just a tilt of the head, barely noticeable, but it was the first motion he'd made since you arrived. You watched him now with more intention. The firelight outlined his silhouette, catching on the frayed hem of his cloak and the glint of something silver at his belt. Not a weapon, at least not obviously so. A token, perhaps, a seal, a key. He turned slightly, just enough for you to glimpse the side of his face. Pale, stubbled, eyes sunken with the weight of too many miles or too little sleep. And then he turned back toward the fire, as if retreating into its glow. You didn't speak, But a strange thought curled its way through your mind. Who waits in silence, in a place built for noise? The tavern sighed again, its timbers groaning softly as the night settled deeper around it. Another gust of wind whistled past, but this time it carried something else, faint, almost imagined, the far-off sound of bells. Not church bells, smaller, hollow and fast, like the bells worn on a jester's hat or the reins of a winter horse. You looked to the door, still closed. No one else reacted. The laughter had died down again. The man with the hood remained still, and yet, you were certain, you had heard it. You pushed the empty bowl aside and leaned back slightly, letting your eyes move once more across the room. The windows were fogged with the breath of the tavern, like each pane held its own tiny storm. Beyond them, darkness. No stars, no moon, just the thick velvet of night. The dogs near the hearth stirred then, both at once. They didn't bark, didn't whine. They simply rose, almost in unison, heads turned toward that narrow door behind the fire, the one you'd noticed earlier, the one cracked open, faint light flickering within. Their ears twitched, their bodies tensed. Not in fear, but recognition. And then the innkeeper returned. He came from the hallway behind the bar, wiping his hands again on that same old cloth, and gave you a glance. Not cold, but sharp. Measuring. "You'll be wanting a room, then?" he asked. You hesitated. Just a beat too long. He noticed. You nodded. "Aye." He moved behind the bar without another word, pulling a key from a ring hidden beneath a wooden panel. The dogs relaxed. The moment passed, but the door behind the fire still stood ajar. And the man in the hood hadn't touched his drink. The room you were given sat at the top of a narrow wooden staircase, tucked beneath the low slant of the tavern's roof. The climb was uneven, each step groaning with age and familiarity, as if every board knew the names and weights of all who had ever passed above it. Your hand grazed the worn banister, polished smooth by years of tired palms. The hallway at the top was dim, lit only by a single lantern, swaying gently from a crooked iron hook. Its flame danced softly, casting long shadows that crept across the low walls. You passed a few closed doors on your way to the end, one of which held a gentle humming behind it, a female voice singing something in a tongue not quite familiar. Another door creaked open just an inch as you passed, but no one appeared. You didn't pause to look. Your door was the last, heavy. The key turned with resistance, as though it hadn't been used in some time. When it gave, it did so with a low, tired sigh. The room inside was simple. A bed, a single stool, and a small table beneath a tiny square window. A thin wool blanket lay folded over the mattress, and a ceramic basin sat on the table's edge with a pitcher beside it, filled with water that still carried the coolness of the night. The walls were bare, save for a small wooden cross nailed crooked above the bed. The air smelled of dust and dry rushes. You didn't light the candle waiting on the sill. Instead, you stood by the window and wiped a patch of fog from the glass with your sleeve. Outside, the world was hushed. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the lantern by the tavern door still flickered, casting golden light onto the packed earth below. A pair of figures stood beneath it, one leaning heavily on a walking stick, the other hunched low and cloaked, gesturing with slow, careful hands. Their voices didn't carry, but their silhouettes moved with quiet urgency, like people who had waited too long to speak and now couldn't find the right words. You stepped back from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, the straw mattress creaking softly beneath you. Your boots were heavy with dried mud, and as you bent to unlace them, your thoughts drifted, not to the road behind you, but to the man at the hearth. There had been something about him. Not just his stillness. It was his silence. In a place where even whispers carried weight, his quiet had felt too deliberate. You finished unlacing your boots and let them fall to the floor. The chill of the room found your toes immediately, curling around them like a cat. You pulled the blanket over your lap and listened. The tavern below had changed its rhythm. The low buzz of voices had thinned, replaced by the scrape of chairs being pulled back, the clatter of tankards collected. A chair fell over with a bang. Someone muttered an apology. The dogs barked once and were shushed. Footsteps, several, moved toward the stairwell, and you heard the groan of those same familiar steps beneath new weight. A soft knock came to the room beside yours. A door opened. A low voice. A woman laughed, then quickly hushed herself. The door shut again. Your own room remained quiet. still. But beneath the silence, there was something else. A low thrum, subtle, like the faraway beat of a drum. Or was it a heartbeat? You held your breath, listening. Nothing. And yet, you still felt it. You lay back on the bed, arms crossed over your chest, staring up at the slanted ceiling. The cross above you hung at a tilt, as if it too had grown tired of watching. The rush of wind outside had softened, but the tavern itself still murmured, like a sleeping creature muttering in its dreams. You thought about the door behind the hearth again. The one no one had gone through. Or had they? You sat up. Something had changed. You hadn't heard the footsteps, but you were sure now. The man from the hearth. He was no longer in the common room, and yet you hadn't seen him leave. You stood, careful not to make the floorboards cry out, and moved to the door. You opened it slowly, the iron latch cold beneath your fingers. The hallway was empty. The lantern still flickered. One door down the way stood open now, the one that had creaked when you passed it earlier. The room inside was dark. You stepped into the corridor, each step deliberate, soundless. At the stairwell you paused. The tavern below was nearly quiet now, just the soft clink of mugs being stacked and the occasional creak of the innkeeper's boots. A few voices lingered, one rising briefly in protest, likely a final round denied. You descended halfway and stopped. From this angle, you could just see the hearth. Empty. The man was gone. The corner where he'd sat still held his untouched mug. The fire behind it had dimmed slightly, though the embers still glowed. And then you noticed the dogs. Both were standing now, alert. One faced the hearth, ears pricked forward. The other had turned toward that narrow door, the one still cracked open. You felt a pull then. Not of curiosity exactly. Something older. A memory you couldn't place. You continued down the stairs. The few remaining patrons barely noticed you. The innkeeper was wiping down the bar, his eyes focused on the grain of the wood, though you sensed he was watching in his own way. You moved slowly toward the hearth. The stool was still warm and the door beside it still open, just slightly more than before. Enough now to see that the light within came not from a candle or lantern, but from a strange kind of glow. Soft blue-white, like moonlight caught in mist. No sound came from within. You glanced at the innkeeper. He didn't look up. You stepped to the door. A narrow stairwell descended into the floor, stone steps worn by time. The air rising from them smelled faintly of crushed leaves, damp earth, and something floral, almost sweet. You hesitated, and then, without truly deciding to, you stepped through the threshold. The tavern behind you faded, the fire's warmth giving way to a cooler, stiller air. The stone beneath your feet was cold, smooth. The light from below pulsed gently, as if breathing. You began your descent, and above you, the door sighed shut. The stone steps spiraled downward with a gentle curve, carved into the earth itself as if the ground had opened willingly to make room. Each step was slightly uneven. Some dipped at the center from countless footfalls, others chipped along the edges. The walls enclosing the staircase were cool and damp, slick with condensation in some places, the scent of wet stone rising faintly to your nose. There was no torch, no fire, and yet the light persisted. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a pale, shimmering glow, soft as candlelight, but without the flicker. It touched the walls and the steps, casting a silvery hue on the stone and lending the air a quality both serene and unreal. You could see, but not clearly. Shadows curled where there should have been none, and shapes hinted at the edge of your vision only to dissolve when you turned your head. Down you went. You couldn't tell how far. At times, you thought you must have turned full circle, that the stairs would lead you back to where you began, but they kept descending. The air grew colder. Not unpleasantly so, but like that of a deep cave, untouched by sun or fire for years, and there was no sound but your own footsteps and breath, slow, steady, muffled by the stone around you. And then the steps ended. You emerged into a narrow corridor with a low ceiling of arched stone, ribbed with dark wooden beams. The walls here were lined with recesses, little alcoves holding small objects, some familiar, others baffling. You paused at one, a bundle of dried lavender bound with red thread crumbling at the edges. Beside it, a small vial of something blue, corked tight, with no label. In another alcove, a child's shoe, tiny and cracked, its sole turned upward like a fallen leaf. The air here smelled of forgotten things. Not decay, not quite. More like memory, quiet, settled, wrapped in linen and left to rest. You walked slowly, one hand brushing the wall to keep balance. At the corridor's end stood a door, not wood this time, but old iron, rounded at the top, inset into the stone like a tooth in a socket. A small symbol was etched into the arch above it, circular. Worn. You couldn't place it. The door was slightly ajar. Beyond it, that same glowing light pulsed gently. You pushed the door open and stepped into a room that did not belong to the tavern. It was round, domed, with walls of dark stone and a floor covered in patterned tiles. The patterns formed no recognizable image, just arcs and circles and twisting lines like ripples on water frozen mid-motion. In the center of the room stood a single table, low and wide, carved of some deep black wood that reflected none of the surrounding light. Upon the table were objects. A goblet made of bone, delicately etched, a length of twine coiled in a spiral, a book bound in faded green leather, its cover blank. And resting on the edge, closest to you, was a silver token, round, thin, etched with a symbol that made your stomach twist, though you could not say why. It matched the one above the iron door. And across the room sat the man from the hearth. He no longer wore his hood. His hair was short, ash blonde, streaked with grey at the temples. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp beneath the pale skin. His eyes were a colour that seemed to shift with the light, at once grey, then green, then something darker. He regarded you without surprise, as though he'd known all along that you would follow. "You heard them," he said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the space, like smoke curling into every corner. You nodded, unsure what them he meant. He gestured toward the table, toward the book. "Most don't, not until the third night. But you heard them before the door was even open." You stepped closer, drawn to the strange pulsing glow that seemed to center around the table. The objects were ordinary, and yet heavy with presence, like relics in a church whose names had been forgotten. "What is this place?" you asked, your voice lower than you expected. The man tilted his head. "A cellar," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with a hint of something. Amusement, perhaps. "A place beneath the place. You've seen the hearth, but this is where the ashes gather." You didn't understand, but the words made sense in a way deeper than meaning. The book on the table caught your eye again. It looked unremarkable, but your gaze kept returning to it. The leather binding was worn smooth at the edges, and the pages, yellowed and curled, breathed slightly, as if stirred by a wind you couldn't feel. "Open it," the man said. You hesitated, your fingers hovered over the cover. "It won't bite," he added softly. You opened it. There were no words, just drawings, crude, almost childish, but striking in their simplicity. The first page showed a forest, drawn in looping strokes, the next a fire. Then a figure sitting by it, hands outstretched. The drawings continued, each one familiar. A road, a tavern, a door. Then you saw yourself, not in the mirror image way you were used to seeing, but there you were, boots muddied, cloak drawn tight, looking into a fire. And on the last page, still unturned, your fingers paused. The man across the room stood now, silent. You turned the final page, a staircase, descending. At the bottom, a circle of stone, a table, and two figures, one seated, one standing. One of them held a book. You closed it gently. The man exhaled. You remember then, but you didn't. Not truly, only a feeling. A deep, strange certainty that this was not your first time in this room. He walked toward the far wall and pressed a hand to the stone. With a groan, a panel shifted inward, revealing a narrow corridor lit by the same soft light. "Not all roads are ahead," he said. "Some circle back." He didn't wait for your response. He stepped into the corridor and disappeared. You stood alone now in the domed room, the book still in your hands. The pages no longer pulsed. The silver token had vanished from the table, and somewhere above, the fire in the hearth burned on, unaware. The domed room had grown quieter, if such a thing were possible. The stillness settled like dust in an old crypt, pressing into your ears, into your thoughts. The air was neither warm nor cold anymore, just still, as if the very motion of time had paused the moment the man disappeared into the corridor. You remained where you stood, fingers curled around the book. The pages no longer breathed, and the cover felt heavier now, as though it carried more than ink and parchment. You considered leaving it on the table, but your hands did not obey. They held it gently but with certainty, like something once forgotten but not quite lost. Your eyes drifted toward the open corridor. It didn't call to you. There was no beckoning wind, no whisper of voices, no compelling vision urging you onward. Yet the emptiness behind you felt even deeper than the unknown ahead. You followed. The corridor was narrow, carved from stone so old it had lost its edges. The ceiling was low, forcing you to duck slightly. The same pulsing glow followed you, though its source remained unseen. Each step echoed behind you, softly at first, then louder, until it was difficult to tell if the sound was yours alone. Then the corridor opened into a small chamber. This one was different. No symbols, no domed ceiling, just stone walls and a raised platform in the center, like an altar. Upon it stood 3 objects: a candle, unlit but tall and ivory white, a bowl filled with what appeared to be dried herbs and blackened petals, and a small, smooth stone, polished to a sheen that reflected the strange light like water. There was a sense of reverence here. Not religious exactly, but sacred in a deeper, quieter way. A place where things were placed, not abandoned. And beside the altar stood the man. His cloak had been shed now, folded over his arm. Beneath it he wore a simple tunic of dark wool, plain and coarse, the kind worn by monks or travellers who cared little for appearance. He regarded the items before him without touching them. When he spoke, it was with the same quiet clarity as before. "These are not yours," he said, "but they are waiting for someone." You didn't reply. He turned slightly, just enough to glance at you over his shoulder. "Do you know how long this tavern has stood?" You shook your head. "Neither do I," he said, almost gently. "And I've been here a long time." His voice wasn't boastful, just matter of fact. As though the years had stopped counting themselves once he passed a certain number, he gestured to the items before him. "Every traveller leaves something behind," he murmured, "some without knowing, others on purpose, a favour, a debt, a fragment." You looked at the stone on the altar. There was nothing remarkable about it, just a smooth river stone, grey with a faint line of white through its middle. "What do you carry?" he asked. You frowned. "Nothing worth placing." He raised an eyebrow, but not in scepticism, in curiosity. "Not yet," he said. Then he walked past you without another word, returning down the corridor the way you came. His footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the silence and stone. You remained in the chamber, unsure why. The bowl of herbs gave off a faint, almost peppery scent now. You leaned forward and breathed it in. Something stirred. Memory, perhaps, or something older than memory. A field, a song, a name you didn't know you'd forgotten. You touched nothing. Instead, you stepped back and turned toward the exit. But the corridor was no longer behind you. Instead, the wall now held only stone, unbroken and solid, as if the doorway had never been there at all. You blinked, touched it. Cold. No seams, no hinges, just solid stone. You turned back toward the altar. The candle was lit. Its flame burned with no smoke, no scent. The bowl beside it was empty now, and the stone gone. You hadn't moved, you were certain. Yet everything had changed. You sat. It felt like the right thing to do. The stone floor was smooth beneath you, and the glow in the room remained steady. You placed the book in your lap and let your hands rest upon it. Time passed differently here. It didn't drag, nor did it rush. It unfolded. Somewhere beyond the walls you could hear something faint, like footsteps above your head. Or perhaps it was the sound of chairs being moved again, of the fire being stoked. You imagined the tavern as it was before, warm, safe, familiar. And then you realized you missed it. You missed the flicker of the flames, the crackle of logs settling in the hearth, the dogs at rest, the clink of mugs, the smell of bread crusts and old wood smoke and spilled ale. You missed the world above. And just as that longing began to settle in your chest, the far wall shimmered. Not opened, not shifted, just shimmered, like heat on stone. And then the sound of laughter, soft, female, echoed through the room. Not mockery, not joy, something in between. Memory laced. You stood slowly, gathering the book again, and walked toward the shimmering wall. Your hand reached forward and passed through. No resistance, no chill, just air, cool and dry. You stepped through. The room behind it was small and round again, but different. This one was filled with mirrors, dozens of them, all sizes, all shapes, some cracked, some so clear they shimmered like water. They hung on the walls, rested on tables, leaned against corners, yet none reflected you. They showed scenes instead. One showed the tavern's hearth empty. Another, the common room, now dark, chairs turned over, candles snuffed. A third showed the narrow hallway upstairs, the doors all closed. And then one mirror flickered. It showed a man hunched over a table, speaking in whispers to someone with no face. The other leaned close, nodding slowly, as if listening to something very important. The scene shifted. Now they were laughing, now arguing, now silent. You realized the man was you, but it wasn't a memory. It hadn't happened. Not yet, or perhaps elsewhere. You turned slowly, letting your eyes scan each reflection. Some were windows into lives that never happened. Others, perhaps, were glimpses into truths too fragile to touch. You were not afraid, but you were very, very awake. In the center of the room, one mirror stood taller than the rest. Oval, framed in black iron, coiled like ivy. It was blank. And then it filled with light. A tavern door opening. A new traveller stepping inside. Cloak soaked, boots heavy. The fire glowed warm again, and everything began once more. You stood before the tall oval mirror, watching the traveller enter the tavern with hesitant steps and wariness clinging to every movement. The door closed behind him, muting the storm outside. In the glow of the mirror, the scene played out in real time. He paused just past the threshold, eyes adjusting as brushing moisture from the edge of his cloak. The fire cracked invitingly. The shadows around the hearth stirred with welcome, but no voice called to him. No one turned their head. He was alone, and yet he was not. You could feel the space around him, the heavy weight of breath held back by unseen watchers, not threatening, not hostile, but expectant, as though the tavern itself had stopped to observe. You leaned closer to the mirror. There, just behind the figure, just beyond the line of his shoulder, you caught a glimpse of something impossible, the faintest echo of your own reflection, but blurred, half-formed. Not on the surface of the mirror, but within the scene itself. You blinked. It was gone. The mirror's surface shimmered again, not unlike the wall you had passed through, but this time it didn't ripple or yield. It simply became dull, clouded, like breath against glass. You stepped back. All around you, the other mirrors had gone dark. One by one, their glow faded, their scenes vanishing into shadow. The last to dim was the cracked one in the far corner, which had been showing a forest path under moonlight. Its final flicker showed a figure waiting beneath an arch of trees. You turned, searching for another door, another corridor, another shimmer in the stone. There was none. Instead, at the edge of the room, where once there had been only wall, a staircase now spiraled upward, wooden this time, worn but sturdy, its railing carved with the same looping patterns you'd seen in the domed room tiles. It felt older than the stone, somehow, or perhaps simply more human. You climbed. The staircase creaked softly beneath your weight, each step a sigh in the silence. The air warmed slightly with each turn, and the light, though still dim, began to take on the golden hue of candle flames. The scent changed as well. Earth and herbs gave way to wax and wood polish, the comforting musk of old floors and warmer spaces. The stair ended not at a grand doorway or another corridor, but at a narrow, low-beamed landing. A single wooden door waited at the top, slightly ajar, as though nudged open by your presence before you'd even arrived. You pushed it gently. It opened without protest, and you stepped into the upper floor of the tavern. But not as it had been. It was daylight here. Pale winter sunlight filtered through small leaded windows, streaking across the worn wooden floor in long golden beams. Dust hung in the air like soft smoke, undisturbed. The hallway was quiet, save for the faint sound of birdsong beyond the window panes. The doors were all closed, but not ominous. They felt rested, like the whole space had been sleeping. Your footsteps made no sound. As you passed the doors, you noticed small details that had escaped you before. One bore a carving near the handle, a rune or letter, partially rubbed away by time. Another had a strip of fabric caught in its hinge, blue and frayed, fluttering slightly as if stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. At the end of the hall stood a wide window, its glass slightly rippled from age. Outside, a courtyard stretched below, one you hadn't seen on arrival. It was framed by low stone walls and held a crooked tree at its centre, its branches bare but regal, like the skeleton of something once crowned with flame. Beneath the tree stood a figure. She wore a cloak of deep green, long and heavy, trailing slightly on the cold stone. Her face was tilted up toward the window, toward you, though you were certain she couldn't see you. Her eyes were closed. In her hands she held something, small, wrapped in cloth. Then her lips moved. She spoke a single word, and though you heard nothing, your bones trembled as if in response. The courtyard faded, the hallway darkened. You turned and found yourself no longer alone. An old woman stood a few paces behind you, hunched slightly but proud in posture. Her hair was bound in a long braid that fell over one shoulder, streaked silver-white like threads of moonlight. Her eyes were dark but not cold, sharp but not unkind. She studied you with the same look the innkeeper had, measuring, weighing, not your worth, but your weight. "You're further in than most," she said, her voice like parchment folding, soft and dry. You opened your mouth to reply, but words felt too loud here. She stepped past you and looked out the window where the courtyard had just been. "This place, it holds more than warmth and ale," she murmured. "It gathers what the road casts off. Names, promises, songs." You waited. She turned back to you. "Do you remember why you came?" You shook your head slowly. She smiled, not with joy, but with understanding. "Most forget on the way in, but it always finds its shape again." Her fingers reached into the folds of her sleeve, drawing forth a small object, round, wrapped in cloth. She held it out to you without explanation. You took it gently. The cloth was soft, almost sheer. Within it, you felt something solid but weightless, familiar, though unseen. "Keep it," she said. "You'll need it before the doors close." You nodded, and when you looked up again, she was gone. The hallway stretched before you, the dust undisturbed. You held the wrapped object in one hand and stepped forward once more, back toward the staircase. But this time it did not lead down. It led sideways. The tavern had changed again, as though each door opened not to rooms, but to memories, or something older than memory. The new hallway into which the staircase led felt unlike the rest of the tavern. It stretched impossibly long, and though you could not say when the daylight had vanished, it was now lit only by low sconces built into the walls, each holding a fat, dripping candle that burned with a flame that leaned slightly inward toward the corridor's center, like drawn breath. Your steps made no sound, yet you could feel the wood beneath your feet as if it remembered being part of a forest, still bearing the weight of wind and age. Along the walls hung tapestries, none matching, none symmetrical. Each seemed to belong to a different era, as though someone had stitched time into fabric and nailed it here for safekeeping. The first showed a great hall, its rafters heavy with banners and smoke. Nobles danced in masks, but their faces were blurred, their limbs too long. A table sat at the center of the scene, lined with silver goblets and an empty throne. The second depicted a woman standing alone on a cliff above the sea, her dress blowing in all directions at once, hair suspended like it had been caught underwater. Her face was clear, calm, resolute, but behind her the sea swirled not with waves, but with staring eyes. The third tapestry showed nothing at all at first glance, just threads of black, tangled and woven without pattern. But when you stood before it long enough, shapes emerged, faint and fleeting, like images forming on the backs of your closed eyelids. A circle, a key, a child asleep beneath a table. You continued walking. The hallway subtly shifted under your feet. The floor sloped gently, almost imperceptibly, as if drawing you inward, or downward again. The air grew warmer, not with the comfort of firelight, but with the kind of warmth that comes before a thunderstorm, thick, electric, waiting. At last you came to a door. It was different from the others, tall, made of a dark reddish wood that gleamed as though it had been freshly polished. A brass handle shaped like a serpent rested at its center, mouth agape as though hissing silently into the air. You touched it. The door opened inward with a slow creak, revealing a room that felt older than the tavern itself. It was vast. Round like the others, yes, but this one soared high into a vaulted ceiling veined with roots. Actual roots, alive and pulsing faintly with light. The walls were lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, each one packed tightly with items not of coin or cup, but of memory. Feathers, faded and delicate, locks of hair tied in string, stones carved with symbols, dried flowers encased in glass, rings, spoons, letters sealed with wax. Some items were clearly ancient, others modern, incongruous. It was not a library. It was not a hoard. It was an archive of leaving, and at the center of the room was a table, round, wooden, familiar. There sat a woman, old yet not frail, with eyes like thunderclouds and hands clasped before her on the table. Her presence was still, but it filled the room like wind fills sails, gently yet completely. A kettle steamed beside her untouched, and 3 empty cups waited, clean and placed in a perfect triangle. She looked up as you stepped in. "I wondered when you'd reach this room," she said, her voice low and velvety, like the beginning of a storm. You said nothing. Your breath caught somewhere in the space between fear and awe. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit! You've brought it, I see." You realized your hand still held the small, cloth-wrapped object given to you by the woman in the hall. It felt slightly warmer now, as though it had grown aware of where it belonged. You sat. She poured the tea, no steam rising from the cups, and waited until you set the object gently on the table. She didn't touch it. Her eyes rested on it only briefly before returning to yours. "This place doesn't ask for answers," she said. "Only offerings, remnants, pieces." You frowned. "Of what?" She tilted her head. "Of you." You wanted to speak again, to ask more, but the room had changed its shape around the words. The moment for asking had passed. She pushed one of the cups toward you. You took it. The tea tasted of things you had never tasted before, but had somehow always known. Summer rain on stone, the sharpness of biting into cold fruit, the warmth of wool left in the sun. It grounded you, opened you, softened something that had been clenching inside your chest since the first step into this place. The woman set her cup down, untouched still. "You've passed the halfway mark," she said. "Most turn back before this point." You glanced around the room. "Back to where?" She smiled faintly, like someone who had been asked that question too many times. "To the part of themselves they haven't yet shed." Your hands curled around the cup, anchoring you. "What is this tavern?" you asked finally. Her gaze turned toward the ceiling, where the roots shimmered faintly. "A place between," she said. "Not one, not many. A hearth for what doesn't belong anywhere else." A pause. Then she reached into her sleeve and withdrew a tiny key, bronze, ornate, no longer than a finger's joint. She slid it across the table. It stopped just beside the cloth-wrapped object you'd brought. "They'll ask for this," she said, "but you must decide when." You looked down at both items, lying there side by side like answers without questions. "Who will?" She did not reply. Instead, she stood slowly, hands trailing the edge of the table, and walked toward one of the towering shelves. She reached into a small space between 2 jars and pulled out a rolled parchment, tied with black thread. It pulsed faintly in her hand, as if alive. She placed it beside the key and the wrapped object, completing the triangle. "Leave one," she said. "Take one." You understood somehow that this choice would echo, not loudly, not immediately, but deeply and forever. You stared at the 3 objects on the table. The parchment, tied with thread dark as riverbed silt, pulsed softly, light gathering at the knot and fading like a heartbeat. The bronze key shimmered faintly, catching the glow from the roots above, its teeth shaped like no lock you'd ever seen. And the object you had brought, still wrapped in that thin, worn cloth, sat motionless, waiting. The woman had vanished between one blink and the next. You hadn't heard her move, hadn't seen her slip through a door. One moment she stood before the shelves, and the next she was simply gone. Only the silence remained, deep and solemn, like a held breath. You leaned forward, fingers hovering over the 3 items. Each held a gravity that tugged at different parts of you. The parchment seemed to hum with knowledge, a promise of names long forgotten or truths unspoken. The key whispered of passage, of thresholds yet to be crossed. And the cloth-wrapped item in front of you, though you still hadn't unwrapped it, felt somehow like memory, like a fragment of yourself left behind long ago and now returned, changed but intact. You closed your eyes. In that moment of stillness, images rose without your asking. A figure waiting beside a tree, her face turned skyward. The dim hallway filled with tapestries that remembered things you'd never lived. The dogs by the hearth, one awake, one dreaming. And the man, his hood drawn low, his silence as steady as the firelight. You opened your eyes. Carefully you reached for the parchment. The moment your fingers brushed it, a warmth surged through your palm. Gentle but insistent. Not heat but recognition. You understood then that it belonged to you, or at least to the version of you that had once walked this place in another time. You slid it toward yourself. Then, slowly, reverently, you placed the cloth-wrapped object where the parchment had been. You did not unwrap it. That felt important. It was not meant to be seen again by you, only held and left. A faint wind stirred across the room, not from any window or crack, but from within the walls themselves. The roots above trembled, their light shifting, cascading over the shelves in a silent cascade of gold. The key remained untouched. You looked at it once more, then stood. The parchment in your hand pulsed again, as if urging you forward. There was no visible exit. No door had opened, and yet the room had subtly shifted. A path had been made, between the shelves, narrow but walkable, curving into darkness. You followed. The passage wound like a river, its walls pressing close, then widening without reason. The shelves beside you grew more chaotic. The items no longer felt catalogued, but placed in haste, scattered, crooked, trembling slightly as if they'd only just arrived. And then you reached the end. It opened into a smaller room. Unlike the others, this one was warm, not in temperature but in tone. The walls were wooden again, the floor uneven, the air thick with the scent of old smoke and something floral, lavender perhaps, or a distant cousin. It was familiar. You stood at the far end of the common room, the tavern, but not as you left it. Now it was bathed in the golden hush of late afternoon. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards. Dust caught the light like snow. The fire had been reduced to embers, glowing quietly in the hearth. Only one figure remained, the innkeeper. He sat at a table near the fire, polishing a mug with the same threadbare cloth, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He looked up as you approached. There was no surprise in his eyes, only recognition. "You made it back," he said. His voice was unchanged, yet something beneath it had softened, like a song once sung in battle, now hummed in peace. You nodded. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Thirsty?" You smiled faintly. "Always." He poured you a drink. The mug was warm to the touch, the liquid inside amber dark, with a scent both spiced and earthy. You sipped without thinking, and the flavour filled your chest with something you hadn't realised you'd lost, belonging. "You left something," he said quietly. "I brought something, too," you replied. He nodded. "That's the balance." You placed the parchment on the table. The innkeeper didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long moment, then met your eyes. "There's one more door." You glanced around. The tavern looked unchanged. The walls, the tables, the flickering light. No doors beyond the ones you'd already passed. He gestured subtly, not to a wall or a hallway, but toward the fire. You looked, and in the low, pulsing glow of the embers, you saw it. Not a doorway in the usual sense, not wood or iron, but a shimmer in the very air before the hearth, like heat rising, like memory forming, like the edge of a dream deciding whether to vanish or stay. You rose. The innkeeper offered no farewell. He simply returned to polishing the mug, his gaze distant now, as though waiting for someone else entirely. You crossed the room slowly, the sound of your footsteps swallowed by the fire's breath. The shimmer pulsed as you approached, rippling faintly, soft as silk pulled tight, and then you stepped through. The shimmer gave way like warm mist, folding around your body without resistance, without cold or heat. It wasn't stepping through air or water or even light. It was like stepping through silence, dense and complete. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no floor beneath your feet. And then there was breath. Not yours, not quite. It came softly as though exhaled from something vast and slumbering. With that breath came a low hum, not musical, but constant, like a loom spinning threads beyond the veil. The sound wrapped around you, coaxing open your senses one by one. The world unfolded again. You found yourself standing in a room unlike any you had seen before. It had no corners. Its floor was made of velvet moss, springy underfoot, glowing faintly in hues of green and silver. The ceiling stretched far above, but not in darkness. Rather, it shimmered like starlight beneath water, a sky turned inward. All around you, walls curved softly, layered in something between wood and bone, carved with patterns that pulsed faintly, alive with memory. At the centre of the room was a single object, a chair. It was carved from dark wood, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. The back was tall, rising in sweeping arcs like wings. No other furniture, no other door. You stepped closer. The hum grew stronger, not louder, but deeper. You could feel it in your ribs, your wrists, the base of your neck. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence. As you approached the chair, you noticed something resting on the seat. A mask. It was shaped like a human face, but smoother, expressionless. Carved from pale wood, the grain running in long vertical lines that shimmered faintly under the ceiling's light. There were no holes for eyes, and yet you could feel something looking out from it. Not watching you, but waiting. You knelt beside the chair. The air was still. Not heavy, not cold, just still. Like the pause before a first word is spoken. You reached out and touched the mask. It was warm. Faintly, just above your fingertips, you sensed something else, a heartbeat. Not your own. A gentle pulse, slow and steady, emanating from the mask itself, as if it had once belonged to someone who had worn it too long and left something of themselves behind. A voice rose within the hum, not spoken aloud, but threaded between the folds of sound and light. To sit is to remember. To wear is to become. You didn't know whether the words came from within the mask or from within you, but they felt true. Your fingers curled around the mask. It lifted easily, weightless in your hands. The wood smelled faintly of smoke and sage, of something once burned and now preserved. You stood and faced the chair. The hum had quieted now, not vanished, but subdued, watchful. You turned the mask over once more, then slowly raised it to your face. As it neared your skin, the world shifted. Not the room, not the space, but everything else. You felt a rush of cold air through a memory not yours, the scent of rain on old leather, a flash of firelight in a stone hall, laughter, rough, familiar, tinged with loss, the weight of a blade across your back, a hand, yours, burying something small and warm into the soil beneath a tree, and then darkness again, but not empty. You opened your eyes, and you were elsewhere. Not a room now, but a courtyard. The same courtyard you'd seen from the window earlier, when the woman in green had stood beneath the bare tree. But now the tree was blooming. Its limbs were full of dark red blossoms, their petals trembling despite the stillness in the air. The sky above was twilight, not dusk, not dawn, but something in between, painted in hues of violet and old gold. The walls of the courtyard rose high around you, vines curling up their sides like veins on an ancient hand. You looked down. Your hands were no longer your own. They were larger, worn, rough-skinned, scarred, a silver ring on one finger. The sleeve at your wrist was embroidered with threads of gold and blue. You wore boots not your own, felt muscles honed by work you hadn't done, bore memories that hovered just outside reach. You were wearing the mask. Or perhaps you were what the mask remembered. And then you heard a door open behind you. You turned. The woman in green stepped through. No longer distant, no longer a vision behind glass. She moved with the grace of someone long familiar with this space. Her face was the same, serene, composed, but her eyes now met yours without hesitation. "I knew you would come," she said. Her voice was the same as the wind in tall grass, gentle, trusting, unafraid. You opened your mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. "You won't remember the words here," she said, "but you'll remember the weight of them. That's what matters." She walked to the tree and placed one hand on its bark. The petals shivered. "This place was built by those who needed somewhere to put the pieces," she said, "the ones they couldn't carry but couldn't throw away." You stepped closer. She turned toward you and held out her hand. In it was a single blossom from the tree, its colour deeper than blood, its edges dusted with gold. You took it. It was lighter than it looked. And when your fingers closed around it, the hum returned, not in your ears this time, but in your chest. "You're ready now," she said, and though you did not yet know what for, you felt something within you begin to open, an ancient door, long sealed, beginning to breathe again. She stepped back, and behind her the courtyard faded, the tree blurred, the mask grew warm, and the hum became a voice once more, familiar now, but still just out of reach. To wear is to become is to return. You closed your eyes and let go. When you opened your eyes, the air felt different, not heavy, not strange, just changed. You stood again in the tavern's common room, but it was empty now. The hearth was cold, its ashes long since settled. The benches were stacked against the walls, and the candle sconces were bare. Even the smell of old smoke, ale and stew had vanished. Only the structure remained, hollow and quiet, like a painting faded beneath glass. The mask was gone, but you felt it still, its presence lingering like a soft pressure behind your eyes, like a scent you couldn't name clinging to your sleeves. The memory of the courtyard clung to you, petals and sky, and the woman's voice woven into the fabric of your thoughts. A single door stood open at the back of the room. It hadn't been there before. You moved toward it with calm steps, each footfall swallowed into the hush. The boards no longer creaked. The floor felt steady, smooth. The light within the doorway was not candlelight nor sunlight. It was pale and constant like the sky just before snowfall. You crossed the threshold. Beyond was a hallway, but not of wood or stone. This one was made of mist. Its walls shifted and curled softly, revealing glimpses of things within, memories perhaps, or echoes. You couldn't be sure. On your left, the mist parted for just a breath and showed a small boy standing beneath a bridge, his boots too large, cradling a bundle in his arms. His eyes were wide with something between wonder and sorrow. On your right, the image of a woman at a loom, her face streaked with tears, weaving gold thread into a dark blue tapestry that swallowed light. Each vision vanished before you could linger. The mist wanted you moving. You obeyed. Time passed strangely here. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. You walked for what felt like hours, or perhaps only moments, until the corridor gradually widened into a chamber. This space was circular, yet not domed. The ceiling arched high above in a perfect oval, and the floor was made of sand, pale, fine, whispering softly as your boots sank into it. In the centre stood a pool, still, glass-like, dark as ink. Surrounding it were 6 stone chairs, equidistant, as if placed for a council long dispersed. They bore carvings, runes, animals, constellations, weathered by time but still whispering their meaning to the soul, if not the mind. You approached the pool. Its surface did not reflect your face. Instead, it showed a road, winding, narrow, carved between jagged cliffs on one side and a sea of low clouds on the other. A single rider moved along it, hooded and hunched, a lantern swaying from their saddle. The wind lifted their cloak in slow waves. You leaned closer. The scene shifted. Now the rider dismounted. Now they knelt beside a flat stone set off the path, wiping moss from its surface. Now they lit a candle and placed it there. The candle's flame flickered, and you felt its warmth on your cheek. You stepped back. None of this made sense in the way that maps or calendars make sense. But it didn't need to. The pool wasn't showing you what had been, or even what was coming. It was showing you what you carried, what you would carry, what had always followed behind you in silence. The woman in green had said this place was for the pieces people could not carry, but could not let go. You were beginning to understand. You turned to the stone chairs. Each bore an emblem. The first, a stag, antlers woven with stars. The second, a crow, wings outstretched, beak closed. The third, a spiral, coiled tight and drawn inward. The fourth, a tower split down the middle, ivy crawling its crack. The fifth, an eye, closed. And the sixth, directly opposite the pool, a hand holding a thread that disappeared into stone. You sat on the sixth. The moment you did, the chamber dimmed, not with darkness, but with silence, a deeper kind. The pool stilled even further, the images gone. The mist receded beyond the walls, everything waited, and then you heard footsteps, not from behind, from above. You looked up, high in the arching ceiling, the mist parted slightly. A figure stood silhouetted against the pale light. A long cloak, hair swept behind one shoulder. You could not see their face, but you felt their gaze settle on you like snowfall. They raised their hand, and with a slow, deliberate motion, they lowered something into the air, a thread. It gleamed gold and trembled as it descended, impossibly long, impossibly fine. It reached down through the air, drifting slowly, drawn not by gravity but intention. It hung just in front of your chest, swaying faintly, weightless. You reached up. Your fingers brushed it, and in that moment you remembered. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. A name once whispered in your ear by candlelight, a promise made in a forest clearing, a door that closed too early, a song hummed for someone who would never hear it again. All of it held within that thread, fragile, burning, endless. You closed your fingers around it and the chamber vanished, not crumbled, not collapsed, just gone, like a breath drawn in and never released. You stood now in a field of tall grass beneath a grey sky. The wind whispered, and in your hand the thread burned softly, waiting. The grass was waist-high and heavy with dew, its silver-green blades bending slightly under the weight of morning. The sky above stretched wide and low, a dome of pale grey mottled with streaks of cloud, as though painted with ash and milk. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no drops had fallen. Not yet. The thread in your hand remained luminous, warm, and impossibly light. It pulsed faintly with your heartbeat, a golden line trailing from your fingers and disappearing behind you, into the space from which you'd just come, though you could no longer see any trace of it. Each breath you took felt deliberate here, as though the air itself asked permission to enter your lungs. There was a strange silence in the field, not empty, but full, as if everything was listening. You began to walk. The grass parted softly around your legs, rustling in hushed voices. There were no paths, no worn tracks in the soil, and yet your feet moved with certainty. Ahead in the distance, barely visible through a wavering shimmer of heat or haze, stood a low hill crowned by a crooked stone arch. It jutted from the earth like a remnant of something broken, part doorway, part monument. One half of the arch stood taller than the other, and its lintel was cracked down the middle, as if struck by time itself. You walked toward it, the thread still trailing behind, now tugging gently, not pulling, not urgent, but guiding. You could feel it humming with direction, a subtle vibration in your palm. As you climbed the hill, the wind picked up. It rolled across the field in slow waves, turning the grass into rippling silver. The arch loomed closer now, its stone dark and pitted with age. Moss clung to its base in patches, and faint etchings curled across its surface. Language, perhaps, or something older than language. You reached out, letting your fingers graze the cool surface of the stone. A whisper rose around you, not from the wind, not from within. It came from the thread. At first it was a murmur without shape, but slowly it found rhythm, then tone, then voice. You could not place the speaker. It was neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It sounded like a memory spoken through cloth, like the echo of a voice you once heard beneath a blanket as a child. Familiar but unclaimed. The thread remembers, it said, even when you do not. The wind slowed, you stepped beneath the arch, and time shifted. Not forward, not back, sideways. The field dissolved around you. The sky darkened, then brightened, then turned to twilight again. The arch crumbled and then rose, whole and proud. You stood still, but the world moved. And then, stillness. You were no longer on the hill. Now you stood in a small candle-lit room, stone-walled, low-ceilinged. The scent of beeswax, parchment, and pressed flowers lingered in the air. A single chair sat at the centre, and in it, a woman. Not the one from the courtyard, not the old woman in the archive, but someone else. Her hair was coiled tightly behind her head, bound with a thread of gold that matched the one in your hand. Her dress was dark and simple. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes half-lidded, as though waking from a long dream. She opened her eyes and looked directly at you. "You brought it," she said, her voice quiet but steady. You nodded. She extended her hand, palm upward. You hesitated. The thread still pulsed in your fingers. You had held it for so long, through so many shapes of time and place, that to release it now felt like unspooling part of yourself. But the pull in your chest, the memory of the pool, of the mask, of the silence before words, guided your hands forward. You placed the thread in her palm. She closed her fingers around it. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the candle flames rose high, almost to the ceiling, and flared blue. A gust of air swept through the room, papers scattered from unseen corners, and then it all died down, leaving only the steady golden glow once more. The woman stood. The thread had vanished, but something shimmered now behind her. A tapestry had appeared, vast, covering the entire wall. You hadn't seen it before. Its fabric rippled as though alive, catching the candlelight in strange ways. It was woven with thousands of tiny threads, some black, some gold, others the palest silver you'd ever seen. Shapes moved across it. Scenes emerged. There was the tavern, flickering in and out of view, the hearth, the stairwell, the dogs, a forest, a river, a child burying something beneath a tree, a figure at a loom, a mirror that reflected a door instead of a face, and among them, yourself. Moving through each memory, each place, walking roads, opening doors, holding the mask. You stepped forward, watching as the tapestry shifted. Now it showed a table with 3 objects resting upon it. A parchment, a key, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Now the mirror room. Now the pool. And now this room. You were there, standing as you were now, and the woman beside you. But the thread was no longer in her hand. It had become part of the weave. You reached out, The tapestry responded. The threads shimmered, and the figures within turned to face you, not with eyes, but with presence, not as ghosts, but as echoes made visible. The woman beside you touched your shoulder. "Every traveller is a thread," she said. "Some fray, some snap, but a few are chosen to tie the ends together." You turned to her. "Why me?" Her smile was soft. Not an answer, but not silence either. "Because you stayed." You looked again at the tapestry, and there, for the first time, you saw the shape of the door. Not one you had entered, one you were meant to create. The tapestry shimmered once more, threads undulating as if stirred by breath. You stood transfixed, watching your own shape move along the fabric, a silhouette of motion and pause, of quiet decisions and unseen burdens. Though your figure was rendered in nothing more than thread and shadow, it carried weight, the kind that didn't bow shoulders, but bent time. The woman beside you said nothing more. She had stepped back, her presence fading like a scent after the candle is snuffed. Not gone, but folded into the room, woven into the silence like an old song no longer sung but still remembered. You turned again to the tapestry. Near its bottom right corner, where the edge had begun to fray, something stirred. The threads there loosened subtly, shifting to form an opening. Not a rip, not a tear, but a passage. A slit of space, humming softly, not unlike the shimmer before the hearth. You stepped toward it, and without touching, without force, the tapestry parted for you. What lay beyond was darkness. Not the absence of light, but a velvety kind of dark, warm and strangely safe. The kind of dark found under blankets, in forgotten closets, in the hush of waiting dreams. You passed through, and again the world reshaped. The dark became dappled. Overhead, a canopy of leaves filtered starlight, though no stars shone above, only pale fragments of sky swimming in a sea of branches. You stood in a forest, though you could not say which or where. The trees here were tall and impossibly thin, their trunks silver-grey and smooth as river stones. Their leaves were long and narrow, whispering gently in a breeze that came from nowhere. Beneath your feet, the ground was soft with fallen needles, your steps silent as breath. Before you stood a path, narrow, winding, not straight like a road, but curved like memory, snaking between the trees as though the forest had grown around it rather than it being carved into place. You walked. There were no markings, no signs, no voices, yet you felt guided. Every so often the path widened to form clearings, small and circular, where stone markers rose from the earth. Not gravestones, something older. Their surfaces bore no names, only shallow grooves and lines etched by time and hand. You paused at one, brushing its surface. The stone was cool, smooth in some places, rough in others. You traced a groove that looped 3 times before fading, like a spiral unfurling before it could finish. You kept moving. With each step, the forest changed, not in appearance, but in tone. The deeper you walked, the more the world around you felt layered, as if the path wound through more than just space, as though you were walking into your own thoughts. Eventually the trees began to thin. Ahead, the path led to a clearing bathed in blue light. You stepped into it, and the air changed. The sky above was open here, and the stars had returned, not as pinpricks of white, but as slow-turning wheels, vast and radiant. They spun gently, almost imperceptibly, casting soft beams that filtered through the mist now swirling low across the grass. At the centre of the clearing stood a table, round, wooden, familiar, but older now, as though this were the first of its kind. Its surface was carved with the same flowing script you'd glimpsed in the arch and the pool's edge. Atop it rested a single object, a book, bound in faded brown leather, cracked at the corners. No title, no lock. A simple ribbon, deep crimson, tied around its width, keeping it closed. You approached. Your hand hovered over it. The ribbon pulsed faintly, as though aware of your presence. You untied it. The knot came loose with a sound like wind through tall grass. You opened the book. The pages were blank, but as you turned them, one by one, faint impressions began to rise, like ink emerging from parchment soaked with time. Shapes, words, scattered lines, a fire, a tavern, a stairwell, a mask, a name. Yours and others, many others. Names you did not know, but which stirred something within you nonetheless. Each page carried fragments, as though each held a story not yet told, but already lived. Some entries were written in delicate hands, others scrawled with haste, some only scratched symbols in the corners. You reached the middle of the book. The page was empty. Then a line began to write itself. not in ink, but in light. It wrote slowly, each letter glowing faintly before dimming into permanence. The one who lingers learns the weight of return. Beneath it, your name appeared, not as it was, but as it had been spoken once, long ago, in a voice now lost to the wind. You closed the book. The ribbon fluttered into your lap like a feather, and then dissolved into mist. You stood, and the stars above pulsed once. A door opened at the edge of the clearing, no more than a shift in the mist, a gentle curling away of the trees. Warm light glowed beyond it. The tavern waited, but not the one you'd left. The first door had welcomed you as a traveller. This door welcomed you as a keeper. You stepped through the mist's soft parting, and the world turned once more. The warmth that greeted you was not sudden, but gradual, like easing into a hot bath after a long frost. The path beneath your feet turned from forest floor to stone, then to polished wood. Light returned, soft and amber, the kind that glows from thick candles and hearths banked low. The scent was unmistakable: oak smoke, bread crust, and the ever-present undercurrent of beeswax and old wool. You had returned, but not to the same tavern you had first entered. At first glance, it was identical. The same wide-beamed ceiling, the same scuffed floorboards marked by hundreds of boot heels and dragging chairs, the same heavy tables that bore names carved in their undersides and memories soaked into their grain. And yet, everything was quieter. No one sat at the tables, yet none were empty. Mugs rested where hands had been moments before. A dice cup lay on its side, a 6 and a 1 frozen in their tumble. A lute leaned against the hearth, one string still vibrating with the last note plucked. Time had not stopped here. It had simply paused. And then, the dogs. They were there again, curled by the fire. The same too. Their ears perked when you stepped across the threshold, and one of them, a brindled hound with eyes too human to ignore, rose and padded toward you. It sniffed once at your boots, then looked up. It did not wag its tail. It did not bark. It simply nodded and returned to the fire. You moved slowly into the room, each step deliberate, reverent. It felt like entering a church where no one prayed aloud, but all were heard. You passed the hearth and paused, your fingers brushing the mantel. There, tucked behind a small iron lantern, was a folded slip of parchment. You opened it. There was no message, just a single mark. The same circular symbol you had seen above the iron door, engraved into the bone goblet carved on the mask. It was no longer just a mark to you. It was a sigil, the kind that wasn't designed or invented, the kind that emerged slowly, through use, through memory. You placed the parchment back and turned toward the stairs. The wood sighed beneath your weight, just as it had before. The candle at the landing had been relit, its flame steady and tall. The hallway above was unchanged, still the row of low doors, still the ripple glass window at the end. But the silence here wasn't empty. It was full of listening. You stopped at the third door on the right. It was slightly ajar. You pushed it open. Inside, the room was almost the same as your first. Same bed, same basin, same single stool. But on the table rested a box. It was small and square, made of dark wood with brass hinges. A simple clasp held it closed. The surface had been worn smooth, as if passed from hand to hand over generations. No keyhole, no markings. You approached, sat, placed your palms on the lid. For a moment you hesitated, not from fear, from awareness. This was not just a box, this was a memory sealed in shape. You lifted the clasp, the lid opened with a soft creak. Inside was the cloth-wrapped object you had left behind, the same one, unchanged, and beside it now rested the key. The bronze one, its teeth still strange, still speaking in the language of locks made for more than doors. You lifted the cloth-wrapped bundle, unfolded it. Within lay a ring, not gold, not silver, iron but smooth and seamless, cool to the touch. It bore no ornamentation, no engraving, but you knew it. Somehow you had worn it before, perhaps in another name, another shape, another story. You slipped it onto your finger. It fit. You picked up the key next. The moment you touched it, the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just attentive, as though the tavern leaned closer. You stepped from the room and moved quietly back down the stairs. The common room still sat in its reverent hush. The dice cup had fallen now, both dice showing ones. Snake eyes. At the far end of the room, beside the fire, a door now stood that had not existed before. It was made of ironwood, polished dark, with carvings of leaves and birds in low relief. No handle, just a keyhole, waiting. You walked toward it. The dogs didn't stir. The key in your hand grew warm. When you slid it into the lock, the door clicked open with no effort at all. You pulled it wide. What lay beyond was not a room. It was a road, paved in old stone, slick with moss, flanked by trees that glowed with internal light. The stars above this path were not stars you knew. They moved, subtly, in slow rotations like the turning of a great clock in the sky. The tavern, behind you, pulsed softly with golden light. You looked back only once, and stepped forward. The door closed behind you without sound, but you knew it would still be there, always, if ever the weight became too much again, if ever you needed to return. The road was neither straight nor winding. It was something else, organic, like it had grown from the land rather than been built atop it. Moss crept between the ancient stones, glistening faintly in the starlight that moved above you, not distant and cold, but watchful, turning slow as if dancing in silence. The trees along either side of the path were tall and dignified, with pale bark that glowed from within, like they held moonlight in their bones. Each step forward felt both light and deliberate. The iron ring on your finger pulsed faintly now, its weight not physical but remembered. A tether, a signal. The key no longer hung in your hand but rested in your pocket, warm and quiet, its purpose fulfilled, or perhaps merely waiting. The silence on this road was not emptiness. It was the breath between notes, a presence. You walked without hurry, without map or question, and in that quiet, thoughts rose unbidden. Not like voices, more like shadows, familiar shapes that moved inside you. You remembered a name whispered by candlelight, not your own, but someone you had once held tightly in sleep. You remembered giving something away, not with regret, but with love. You remembered hunger in winter and the kindness of a stranger who asked for nothing in return. These were not stories you had been told. These were yours. Not all, perhaps, but enough. As you walked, the trees began to thin. The air grew clearer, colder but clean, like water drawn from deep stone wells. Ahead, a structure began to form in the distance. It wasn't large, low-roofed, round, built from dark stone and timber, half hidden in a thicket of low fog that swirled at its base like a shawl. A lantern flickered by the door. You approached slowly, your boots silent against the mossy stone. There was no sign, no symbol, yet you knew. This was a place meant to be arrived at. Not sought, not summoned, but found. The door was already ajar. Inside, the room was warm. A fire burned low in a stone hearth, its light playing gently across wooden walls. A few shelves held small objects, glass bottles filled with dried herbs, scrolls tied with twine, a stack of wooden bowls carefully aligned by size. A cot rested in the far corner, its blanket neatly folded. In the centre of the room sat a round table, smaller than the one in the tavern, worn smooth from decades of hands. One chair was empty, the other was not. A man sat there, back straight, hands resting atop the table. His hair was silver, falling loose to his shoulders, his beard trimmed close. His eyes were closed. He wore simple robes the colour of dusk, neither blue nor grey, but something between. As you stepped inside, his eyes opened. He looked at you without surprise. "I've waited," he said. His voice was deep but not heavy, like the last echo of a bell after it's rung. You didn't speak. Somehow it wasn't necessary. He gestured to the chair across from him. You sat. The fire popped softly. "You crossed through the hearth," he said, "and the mask and the mirrors. You drank the tea. You left the offering. You nodded once, and now you wear the ring." Your hand moved instinctively, thumb brushing the iron band. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what that means?" You considered. "That I am bound?" He smiled faintly. "Yes, but not trapped." He reached into the folds of his robe and brought out something wrapped in cloth. Slowly he set it on the table between you and unfolded the corners. Within lay a small circular object, stone, dark and smooth, with a hole through its centre, a spindle weight. He placed it upright. Then, from a pouch at his waist, he drew a thin line of golden thread. "I'm going to ask you to remember," he said, and he began to spin. Not with tools, not with wheels, with his hands. The golden thread moved between his fingers as if pulled from air, and the spindle turned, its hum quiet but steady. As it spun, the room changed. Not visibly, there were no flickers of light or sudden sounds, but within. Something tilted, something opened. You saw your reflection in the firelight, not your face as it was now, but as it had been before, weathered, younger, forgotten, and then another version, and another. shifting, folding into each other like pages turned in wind. "Who am I?" you asked. The man did not stop spinning. "You're the one who remembered." The thread in his hands gleamed brighter. "You're the one who stayed long enough to return. You didn't close the door behind you. You waited, and now others will walk through." You blinked. The spinning slowed. The man wrapped the thread around the spindle, tying it gently. He handed it to you. "This," he said, "is the thread of remembering. Not yours alone. You will carry it, as others did, until it needs to be left behind again." You took it. The moment it touched your palm, your heartbeat aligned with its weight. You felt the tavern again, not as a building, but as a space inside you. A quiet hearth, a flicker, a breath. The man stood, his chair creaked. You followed suit. "There's one more place," he said. "One more table. It doesn't belong to the tavern or to you, but it's waiting." He opened the door for you. The stars turned overhead. You stepped once more into the road, the spindle in your hand, the ring on your finger, the key in your pocket. Not a traveller now, not quite, but something between. The night deepened, though the stars never dimmed. If anything, they grew clearer, sharper, closer, as if they recognized the thread you now carried and chose to reveal themselves more completely. Their constellations no longer formed the shapes you had once known, no hunters or maidens, no ships or dragons. Instead, the stars coalesced into patterns you felt more than understood, rings within rings, spirals that tugged gently at the corners of memory, lines that hummed in the same key as the iron band upon your finger. The road beneath you changed with the silence. Where once moss grew between ancient stones, now soft earth cushioned your feet, rich and damp with the scent of loam. Trees gave way to tall hedges, grown wild but not tangled, lining the path in gentle arcs. Occasionally a branch reached across, bearing fruit that glowed faintly, pearl-coloured, pulsing with an inner life. Their scent carried lightly on the breeze. You didn't touch them. The spindle in your hand remained warm. You could feel the thread wound around it, not pulling but guiding, as though it knew you were ready. After a time that stretched like dusk across distant fields, you reached a gate. It wasn't large, nor ornate, just 2 posts of twisted birch and a wooden bar across the centre, looped in place with simple rope. Beyond it stood a wide meadow, moon-washed, low with mist. In the distance, nestled at the centre like a pearl in a shell, was a small, round pavilion. Pale stone, open walls, no door. Its domed roof glinted with dew. You undid the rope and stepped through. The mist curled at your ankles, cool and damp but without chill. The grass beneath was soft as wool, spotted with small white flowers that opened slowly as you passed. Your presence stirred nothing into flight. No birds, no insects, even the breeze quieted. As you approached the pavilion, you saw that something waited within. A single table, wide and low, carved of stone so smooth it reflected the sky above. And seated at it were 7 figures. They were not cloaked in shadow, nor shrouded in brilliance. They simply were, each seated in silence, their forms still, their hands resting gently on the table's edge. They were of many shapes, many ages. A woman with white braids draped over her shoulders, a man whose skin bore lines like ancient bark, a youth with silver rings in his ears, their eyes deep as the sea, another whose face was veiled in gauze that flickered like candlelight. None looked at you directly, yet each acknowledged you as you stepped into the circle. The 8th seat was empty. You knew it was yours. You stepped into the pavilion, the mist parting like breath. The moment you crossed the threshold, sound returned, not from the world but from within. A hum, low and rich, rising from the spindle in your palm. The thread vibrated faintly, alive, like a string drawn tight between stars. You sat, and the hum grew louder, then softened again, settling into the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. The figure directly across from you lifted a hand, long fingers curled gently inward. Their voice, when it came, was neither male nor female. It was the voice of stone warmed by sun, of the space beneath a root. "You have returned with what was left," they said. You nodded. The spindle lay in your hand, steady. Another figure spoke, their tone like leaves shifting underfoot. You crossed where others stopped, sat where others fled, opened what others feared. The one with the candlelight veil leaned forward. "Do you understand what you now hold?" You looked down at the thread wound around the spindle. You thought of the tavern, of the woman in green, of the book filled with untold names, of the key, the mask, the forest path, of all the things you had seen and not seen, all the truths spoken without words. "I think I'm beginning to," you said, and that was enough. The oldest figure among them, an elder with eyes like polished obsidian, extended their hand toward the center of the table. There, as if from the stone itself, rose a small flame. It did not flicker. It glowed steadily, pale blue with a core of gold. It made no sound, but it warmed your skin and you realized this was not fire. It was memory, made visible. The figure gestured. Place the thread in the flame. You unwound the spindle slowly, the thread stretching between your fingers, shining even as it slackened. When you laid it into the fire, it did not burn. It curled like smoke rising and then was gone. But its light remained. Above the table, in the open air beneath the dome, the light began to weave. You watched as it stitched itself into the sky, not as constellations, but as a new shape, a door. An arch of golden thread. Each strand was something you remembered, something you carried, something you chose not to forget. A hush fell over the circle. The door above glowed. And then, for the first time, one of the figures turned to face you fully. It was the youth with the silver rings. Their voice was quiet. You're not meant to walk through it. You looked at the glowing arch above. It shimmered like moonlight in a pond, impossibly close, impossibly far. The youth smiled softly. You're meant to keep it open. And with those words, the wind returned. It whispered through the pavilion, across the meadow, down the path, back through every corridor and chamber you had passed. You felt it touch the mirror room, the mask, the firelit stairs, the domed archive. You felt the tavern stir, and deep inside, something answered. The wind curled gently around the pavilion, stirring the folds of your clothing and lifting the pale mist at your feet. It did not rush or howl. It moved like breath, like a quiet exhale from the mouth of the earth. Overhead, the arch of golden thread shimmered against the night, its shape steady, its light soft, like something newly woven into the fabric of the stars. The figures at the stone table remained still, each gaze lowered or turned slightly toward the glowing arch. They did not speak further. There was nothing more to say. The moment had already spoken, and the silence that followed was the kind that sealed things into permanence. You looked again at the thread now suspended above you. It no longer pulsed or swayed. It held, not as something fragile, but as something entrusted. A warmth stirred in your chest, not pride, not joy, something quieter, like the echo of a promise you hadn't realized you'd made and had just now remembered. You stood slowly. None of the others moved to stop you. They simply watched, not with judgment, but with recognition. Each one had once stood as you now did. Each had once carried the thread, sat at the table, woven something back into the world that had begun to slip away. You stepped backward from your seat, and the pavilion did not resist your departure. The mist thickened slightly at the threshold, but parted as your feet found the path again. The arch overhead dimmed as you turned, not in disappearance, but in humility, like a flame lowering its voice in the presence of night. You did not look back. The meadow gave way once more to the tree-lined road, though it now felt different, warmer, more awake. The trees you passed as you returned whispered more clearly. Their leaves rustled not randomly but in rhythm, as if echoing a lullaby too old for words. The path turned where it once had not. And there, nestled into the slope of a hill where before there had been nothing, stood the tavern, but not the one you had left. This one was older, or newer, or truer. It was made of thick stone, weathered smooth. Its roof bowed slightly with age, and ivy curled gently around its edges. A low lantern flickered by the door, casting a pool of light that danced on the worn stone threshold. The shutters were open, and from inside, the glow of firelight spilled softly out into the night air. You stepped toward it. No sound came from within. No clatter of mugs, no laughter, no loot. Just the fire and the silence it guarded. You placed your hand on the door. It opened before you could push. Inside, the room was empty. No patrons, no barkeep, just the hearth, burning low with coals that pulsed like sleeping embers. The chairs and tables were arranged as if expecting company, but patient in their wait. The dogs were there, though only one now, the brindled hound who had once nodded to you. He lay by the hearth, eyes half-lidded, tail gently thumping once as you stepped in. You removed your cloak, hung it on the peg near the door. walked to the hearth, sat in the chair that had always been waiting for you. The spindle was no longer in your hand, but its warmth lingered in your fingers. You reached into your pocket. The key was still there. And beside it, though you could not remember placing it there, was the folded parchment from the mantel, the one with the mark. You laid them both on the table beside you. The fire crackled once, stretching upward in a sudden curl of flame, and then across from you a door opened, not loudly, not in greeting, but in invitation. A traveller stepped inside, cloaked, boots muddied, eyes scanning the room. Their shoulders were tight with road weariness, their breath shallow with caution. They paused just past the threshold and looked at you. You did not speak, but you nodded. The traveller moved forward. They passed the tables slowly, drawn by the glow of the fire, the warmth of the room, and something else, something just beneath the surface. Their eyes moved to the hearth, to the empty stools, to the corners of shadow, and finally to the table where you sat. They did not ask if they were welcome. They knew. You gestured toward the stool across from you. The traveller sat, and in that moment the tavern sighed gently, like a great bellows releasing breath. The walls relaxed, the beams above creaked softly, the fire settled into a deeper, richer glow. You did not ask their name. They did not offer it. Instead you reached for the parchment, unfolded it, pushed it across the table. They read the symbol, looked at you, and in their eyes you saw it. They too had begun to remember. Not everything, but enough. Outside the wind stirred the ivy, and overhead the stars traced their slow, perfect arcs. And in the quiet room where stories paused and doors waited, another thread began to weave. The traveller across from you did not speak for a long while, but they did not need to. In the low light of the hearth, with the soft shifting of the fire and the rhythm of silence between you, words became unnecessary. There was recognition in the pause, the kind that lives not in the mind but in the marrow, like hearing a lullaby you never learned, but somehow know. Their hands were weathered, knuckles red from cold, and when they removed their gloves, they laid them on the table with slow, deliberate care. One glove bore a rip near the thumb, hastily sewn with mismatched thread. A story clung to that rip, you could feel it, something sharp, something earned. You poured them a mug of ale from the small cask at your side. It was already warm, already waiting, as if it had been expecting this precise moment. They accepted it with a small nod and sipped, their shoulders lowering just enough for the weight to shift. You watched the fire together. Time passed gently, the kind of time that didn't move by the tick of a clock but by the soft fall of ash, the stretch of wood releasing its last crackle into flame. The tavern around you settled further. You heard the faint creak of beams adjusting, the quiet lap of wind against shuttered glass. Somewhere upstairs a door shut softly, not in warning, but in closure. The traveller finally spoke. I thought the road would end. Their voice was low, hoarse, like it hadn't been used in days or years. You tilted your head slightly. But it didn't, they added. It just turned into something else. They looked down at the parchment you'd given them, the one with the sigil. I've seen this before, in dreams, carved on a stone near a well, once in frost on a window. They smiled, barely. Always when I needed to remember something I didn't yet know. You said nothing, only listened. They leaned back slightly in their chair, gazing into the hearth, mug cradled loosely in both hands. I crossed a bridge before the mist. It had no rails, just rope on either side. The river below was loud, but I couldn't hear it, only feel it through the wood. Every plank was a name. Their brow furrowed, not in confusion, but in memory. One of them was mine, not the name I use now, but the one I once wore. I nearly turned back, but I didn't, and on the other side, the world had changed. Their eyes lifted to yours. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's dream, but it smelled like home. You nodded once, and then slowly, deliberately, you reached into the pouch at your side and pulled forth the key. It was still warm, still bronze, still impossibly old. You slid it across the table. The traveller stared at it, didn't reach for it. It's not my time, they said softly. No, you agreed, but it will be. They looked back to the fire, their thumb tracing the rim of their mug. The dog stirred near the hearth, lifting its head, then setting it back down. A brief acknowledgement of the presence between you both. The traveller leaned forward. I dreamed of this place, they whispered, but it was different. How? In the dream, I was alone. You considered that. Then you aren't. They swallowed. Not from fear, from the settling of something long suspended. You've been here before, they said. You answered with silence. The traveller reached into their own coat and withdrew a token, a small carved disc of pale wood. It had been smoothed by years of turning in a pocket, worn to a lustre by time and fingers. The image on it was faint, a circle within a circle. Not unlike the sigil. They placed it gently beside the key. I carried this without knowing why, they said. You watched it. It pulsed once, then stilled. You reached forward, turned it in place, and underneath, scratched into the wood in the thinnest of lines, was a name. Not yours, not theirs. A third, a link. You looked to the traveller. I think you're remembering. They closed their eyes, lips parting just slightly, as though the act of remembering hurt, but softly, like pressing on a bruise that has just begun to heal. Yes, they breathed. The fire shifted, casting light on the ring at your finger. The iron glinted, catching the attention of both of you. The traveller stared. I've seen that ring, they said, voice hushed. You nodded. So have I. You both sat still again, and then slowly you lifted the ring from your finger. Its weight lingered on your skin even after it left, like warmth after sun. You placed it beside the token. The circle was forming. Parchment, key, ring, token, each one a piece of the story, each one a marker in the long and winding road. The traveller leaned back once more, and for the first time they smiled. Small, tired, but real. Maybe the road didn't end, they said. Maybe it just became a room. You lifted your mug. The ale was still warm. You clinked it gently to theirs, and somewhere in the tavern's beams, in the soot above the hearth and the dust between the floorboards, something ancient sighed with ease. Another thread had found its way home. The fire had settled low, its coals now glowing deep orange, pulsing gently like the breath of something dreaming. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, curling around the legs of the table and slipping up the walls. The light was no longer enough to banish the dark. It only softened it, made it gentle. The tavern, too, had shifted, not visibly, but you could feel it. Something in the beams, in the quiet timber of the walls, a hum not of sound, but of knowing. As though the building itself had turned its attention inward, not to observe, but to listen. The room was holding its breath in the way only very old places do when something sacred happens quietly, without being asked. The traveller across from you leaned forward, arms resting on the table now, eyes no longer searching. The lines in their face had eased slightly, though the marks of their journey remained. Mud crusted in the seams of their boots, a faint scratch along the cheekbone, the kind that comes from passing too close to bramble in the dark. But they had stopped running. That much was clear. They picked up the token again, turning it once in their palm. This name, they murmured, tracing the faint carving on its underside. It doesn't belong to me. No, you said, but it led you here. Their eyes rose slowly to meet yours. You added, sometimes names are not destinations, only lanterns. The traveller exhaled. It was not a sigh, it was a release. And then the room shifted again. A soft creak overhead, a rafter settling, the faintest sound of a door opening. Not the front, not the cellar, upstairs. The traveller turned, eyes drawn to the sound. Their hands still on the token, they stood, slow and deliberate, as if sensing a rhythm they were meant to follow. You did not stop them. They stepped away from the table, boots making no sound on the old wood, and made their way to the staircase. You watched as they disappeared from view, passing out of the firelight and into the shadows that waited above. You waited, not for their return, but for what came next. After some time, the silence returned fully, folding itself around you like a shawl. The ember light settled into a steady, glowing rhythm. The dog by the hearth, still and curled, snored softly now, only a breath, but enough to ground the room again in the familiar. You turned back to the table. The ring, the key, the token, the parchment. Still there as they had been, but something had changed. They were no longer waiting, they were ready. You gathered them gently one by one and placed them into a small satchel resting near your feet. The cloth was old but strong, lined with a pattern of leaves stitched long ago by someone whose name you no longer remembered, though the shape of their hands returned briefly to your memory. You tightened the drawstring, and then you stood. The fire whispered, as if to say it would hold the hearth until your return. You nodded once. then turned toward the door at the back of the tavern. It wasn't there before, at least not in the way doors usually are. It was set into the wood with no frame, no handle, just the faint outline of something that wasn't wall and wasn't passage, but was both, a seam in the world, a choice in waiting. You stepped toward it. As you reached it, the ring inside the satchel grew warm again, and with a gentle press of your palm, the door gave way. Behind it was night. Not the night of the road you had walked before. This was deeper, quieter. The kind of night that has no stars, not from absence, but from closeness. The kind of night that leans in and listens, that remembers dreams not yet dreamed. You stepped into it, and the tavern let you go. There was no sound, no rush of wind, just a soft echo behind your steps, like the fading ring of a bell after it's been answered. The ground beneath your feet was not stone or moss or sand. It was memory, soft and shifting, holding your weight without resistance. The sky above pulsed slowly, a dome of deep violet, like the inside of a shell held up to your ear, and ahead, distant but certain, a light, flickering, waiting. You walked toward it. Each step no longer carried only your weight. You carried the names now, the ring, the thread. The unfinished pages of stories too long left untold. You carried them not as burdens but as kindling, and something somewhere stirred. Not a warning, a welcome. The light ahead was not a torch. It did not flare or waver. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat wrapped in flame. Each pulse spread through the darkness in soft ripples, and where those ripples touched the night, outlines began to take shape. A path revealed itself, not one laid with stone or wood, but a path of presence. Each step forward summoned the next, as if your movement allowed the world to unfold one breath at a time. The dark did not resist you. It parted, not with reverence or caution, but with quiet acceptance. Like an old friend, not surprised to see you return. The satchel at your side shifted with each step. Its contents, light though they were, seemed to hum faintly, almost in harmony with the light ahead. You could feel the spindle's memory, though the thread itself had been surrendered. You could feel the iron ring, the brass key, the wooden token. Each object a different kind of weight. Not one of mass, but of memory, of meaning, of the long echo of belonging. And then the path opened. You emerged into a clearing. No trees bordered it, no hedgerows or walls. It ended simply at the edge of a vast lake. The water was impossibly still, its surface a perfect mirror to the sky above. But where the sky was deep violet, streaked with shifting stars, the lake reflected something else. Firelight. Hundreds of small flames, each floating on a narrow plank of carved wood, drifting slowly across the lake's surface. Lanterns. Each one bore a different color of flame. Blue, gold, crimson, silver. They did not burn like fire. They glowed like memory, gentle, warm, eternal. They didn't flicker or fade. They drifted, silent and sure, toward the center of the lake where the largest of them all waited. An island, tiny, round. On it stood a single stone table. Not wide like the ones before, not ornate, plain, worn smooth by countless hands, and at its center, a single bowl of black clay filled with water that reflected no light at all. You stood at the edge of the lake, and there, just beside you, waited a boat. Small, flat-bottomed, made of wood darker than night, carved with the same spiral patterns you had seen etched across other places on your journey. No oars, no rope, but it knew you. When you placed one foot upon it, it did not rock or shift. It simply accepted your presence and began to drift slowly without direction, yet with purpose. You sat cross-legged at its center, the satchel at your side, and watched as the lake embraced you. The lanterns passed close now. Some hovered near the edge of your boat, their flames bowing toward you in greeting. Each one carried a memory, though they did not speak. Yet as they floated past, you felt a piece of their shape, their meaning, curled gently against your ribs. You passed one that smelled of lavender and parchment, another of rain on slate roofs. One reminded you of a laugh long forgotten, another of a goodbye that never found words, and yet none of them weighed you down. They simply passed, and you acknowledged them. The island grew closer. The stone table came into clearer view, and behind it now stood a figure. Neither tall nor short, neither old nor young. Their face was obscured not by shadow, but by distance of meaning, like trying to recall the features of someone you once knew only in a dream. They stood with their hands folded before them, their stillness profound. As your boat touched the edge of the island, you stood. The shore was only a few paces wide. It held no trees, no grass, only smooth earth, bare and soft beneath your boots. You stepped forward. The figure watched. You did not ask for permission. You approached the table and gently laid the satchel beside the bowl. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the figure stepped forward and opened the satchel without a word. They withdrew the key first, held it in both hands. Its edges glinted as if lit from within. Then the ring. They turned it slowly, examining the worn metal with a kind of quiet grief. Not sorrow, but reverence. As if remembering all the hands that had worn it, all the moments it had bound into silence. Then the token. They pressed it to their chest, closed their eyes, and placed each item one by one into the bowl of water. The surface did not ripple. Instead, it absorbed each object without sinking them. They hovered just beneath the surface, suspended in stillness, glowing faintly. You waited. The figure stepped back, and then for the first time spoke. You are not the first. Their voice was like wind through reeds, soft, low, ancient. But you remembered far. They looked at you, though their features remained elusive, and you listened, when others only asked. You nodded. There is one more task, they said, the one all keepers must choose. You said nothing. They reached into the folds of their robe and brought forth a flame. It floated above their palm, small, golden, no larger than a candle's, but it radiated more than heat. It gave off memory and longing. They extended their hand toward you. This is the last light of what was lost. You did not reach for it. Instead, you asked, where must I carry it? Their voice was quieter now. Where it will be found. You stepped forward, cupped your hands and received the flame. It did not burn. It settled into your palms like it had always belonged there. And in that moment you understood. This was not a task. It was a return, a reminder. That all lights are only waiting to be carried home. The flame sat in your palms without weight. Yet your arms knew the gravity of it. Its glow did not cast outward like firelight, but inward, curling gently into your skin, your breath, your memory. It did not speak, yet you felt its story unfolding quietly within you, one page at a time. The figure at the stone table stepped back, hands now empty, face unreadable. The flame was yours. You looked down at it. Within its golden core, tiny shapes moved, ripples, flickers, echoes of places you had been and ones you had not yet reached. You saw the outline of the tavern's door, the tilt of a child's head beneath a tree, a cup set on a hearthstone untouched, a key resting on a palm, a mirror without reflection. You saw your own hands stretched across time, placing tokens into bowls, pages onto tables, memory into rooms no one else could enter. The flame pulsed once, softly. It was ready, and so were you. You stepped back from the table and turned toward the boat. It had not drifted. It had waited, exactly where you had left it, still as a thought held just behind the teeth. As you stepped aboard, the lake rippled outward in silent concentric rings, the lanterns now drawing a path before you, not in a straight line, but a gentle curve that led toward the shore you had never seen. You held the flame gently before you, not to guide, to witness. The boat glided forward once more, each stroke of unseen current, carrying you deeper into the path that the flame remembered. Above, the stars stirred again. They had changed shape, no longer scattered. Now they gathered, threads of light weaving into an image that had no name, only feeling. A circle that never closed, a door never shut, a road that curved inward and outward in the same breath. The shore arrived without announcement. It did not rise or loom. It welcomed. The land here was not like where you had come from. It was quieter, yes, but also warmer, like soil after a long sleep, turning gently under spring's first hand. The air smelled of old parchment and sweet herbs, of smoke without fire, of rain that had not yet begun. It felt like standing on the threshold of a story that had not been written, but already remembered. You stepped onto the shore, and you saw the tavern, but not the one before. This was the tavern as it had always meant to be, built not just from wood and stone, but from the names carried in the dust, the warmth left behind in chairs, the stories spoken too softly to last, but which did. The door was open. Inside, voices murmured, not loud, not distinct, but present, steady, familiar. The hum of people remembering how to speak to each other in the old ways, without haste, without proof. You stepped inside. They looked up as you entered. Some were at tables, others by the fire. A few leaned on the beams or stood by windows, listening to the wind. Every face bore the echo of a road long walked. No one asked who you were. They knew. In this place, names were not exchanged. They were carried like thread from one story into the next. A space had been left for you, not a throne, not a seat of honour, a stool, a modest place by the fire. You walked to it. As you sat, the flame in your hands flared softly, then folded into itself. You felt it settle deep in your chest, not extinguished, but returned, absorbed into the rhythm of your breath, into the quiet strength of your limbs. You were the flame now. Or perhaps you always had been. Across from you, someone reached for a mug. Their hands trembled slightly. They looked at you, their voice low, rough. "I dreamed this place once," they said, "but when I woke I thought it was only a longing." You nodded. It was. They smiled, slowly, warily, the way one smiles after years of waiting for silence to speak back. You lifted a mug, so did they. You clinked them gently, and the sound it made was older than any toast. It was the sound of a door creaking open inside the self, of a table being set for someone returning, of warmth rising up from stone. The fire cracked behind you, and in the shadow it cast, something stirred, a figure standing in the doorway, cloaked in dust, boots wet from roads unnamed. They paused, breath catching at the threshold. You turned and smiled, because you had seen this before. You had been this before. You reached into your pocket and felt the key there once more, warm, waiting, and beside you the fire burned steadily, not in greeting, in welcome. The figure at the door did not move at first. They stood wrapped in shadow, framed by the soft amber light from within, their silhouette motionless, listening perhaps for something only they could hear. The hush of distant branches, the memory of laughter, the rhythm of their own breath, slowing just enough to cross the threshold. Then one foot stepped in. Not loud, not hesitant, measured. The tavern accepted them without ceremony. The light shifted slightly, as if drawing open a seat beside the hearth before the figure even chose to sit. The voices in the room did not hush, nor did they swell. They adjusted, seamlessly, the way wind moves through trees already waiting for it. You watched the figure approach. A cloak of thick, green-grey wool hung around their shoulders, the edge soaked from some distant mist. Their hair was tied loosely, flecked with what might have been dried leaves, or perhaps just the gold of early twilight. Their hands were empty, but their presence was not. It carried with it something old and unnamed, not a burden, but a history. You stood, not for ritual, not for duty, out of recognition. They stopped a few steps away, their eyes meeting yours with a kind of exhausted hope, the sort that arrives when a long search finds no answer, but finally finds rest. You reached into your pocket. The key was there, still warm. You extended it without a word. Their eyes widened slightly, not in surprise, but in memory. Fingers closed around it, slowly, carefully, as though it might vanish if taken too fast. They looked at you again, and you saw the beginning of tears behind the gaze. Not for pain, for return. You gestured to the fire. They sat. The circle near the hearth had grown since you first arrived. More figures gathered now, some seated, others standing nearby. No one spoke loudly. No one asked names. But when someone shifted, when someone leaned forward to pass a mug, when someone touched a shoulder in passing, there was understanding. You reclaimed your seat. The new traveller held the key on their lap for a long time, turning it slowly, brushing a thumb along its teeth. A story was gathering, not to be told, to be remembered. Near the window, another figure reached for an instrument. A dulcimer, old and soft-voiced, its wood scuffed and varnish worn. They plucked a string, then another, until a low, winding melody began to thread its way through the air, unfolding like something long trapped beneath silence. The kind of song you don't recognize until halfway through, and then realize you always knew. You leaned back, your shoulders no longer heavy, your spine now molded to the curve of the chair that had shaped itself to you. The warmth of the fire touched your cheeks, and the quiet rhythm of the tavern settled into your chest. Outside, the wind curled around the stone foundation and whispered under the door, not asking to be let in, just greeting the ones who had finally arrived. The key passed hands. The flame in your chest flickered once, and across the room another stood, slowly, as if pulled by something familiar. They made their way to the newest traveller and knelt to speak, their voice low, their hand brushing the damp edge of the cloak. Another story, another echo. The room received it. This was how the tavern grew, not in size, but in depth. Each arrival made it older and newer at once. Each silence held the shape of what had just been spoken. Each ember carried the breath of someone who had once sat where you now sat. The dulcimer's song shifted again, minor now, but not sorrowful, reflective. You closed your eyes, and for a moment you were every version of yourself that had walked through the door, the one with mud on your boots. The one descending stone stairs beneath a hearth, the one kneeling before a pool that held no reflection, the one standing in starlight holding a thread of gold. You were the one who stayed, and the one who had just arrived, and around you the walls remembered. Not as stone remembers heat or wood remembers weight, but as story remembers voice. Your breath came slow, even, and you felt the room turn with you, not toward ending, but toward keeping. The dulcimer's last note hung in the air long after the player had lifted their fingers. It floated above the firelight, suspended in the quiet like the final glimmer of a dream before waking. No one clapped, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not absence, it was reverence. The kind that grows only in places where listening has become an art. The newest traveller, still holding the key, sat with it cradled in both palms as if weighing not its metal, but its memory. Their gaze was distant but not lost, focused on something inward. You could see it in the way their fingers tensed and relaxed around the shaft. They were remembering, not with their mind but with their hands. Across the fire, the one who had spoken to them earlier now stood again, wordlessly retrieving something from their satchel. A bundle, small, wrapped in cloth. It was handed over gently. The traveller unwrapped it. Inside was a lock of hair, dark, bound with red thread, and a tiny wooden carving of a bird in flight. No bigger than a thumb, the bird had wings stretched wide and one side slightly worn, as though it had been kept in a pocket for years. The traveller's lips parted slightly. A sound escaped. Not a word, not even a name. Just breath given shape by grief. You watched as their eyes welled. One tear slid down their cheek, slow and unhurried. It fell onto the carving and remained there, glistening. No one moved to comfort them. No one needed to. They were not alone. That was comfort enough. The traveller held the bundle to their chest. The key, still in their other hand, was now tucked quietly into their belt. They would not open any doors tonight, but they would rest. The first kind of rest that isn't sleep, but the stillness that comes before it. You looked around the room. The others remained, not frozen, but at ease. One figure traced a finger along the edge of their mug, another leaned their head against a beam, eyes closed. Someone near the window stood silently, watching the wind move outside as if reading it, and beneath it all, the tavern breathed. Not with lungs, not with effort, but with presence. Its walls did not creak with age now, they murmured with memory. Its beams no longer strained, they held, steady, soft. You rose from your seat and walked to the far end of the room. A door waited there, one you had not noticed before. It bore no handle, no hinges, just a smooth surface of oak so dark it seemed almost black in the firelight. Set into its centre was a shallow circle, perfectly carved, no larger than your palm. You placed your hand there, the wood warmed beneath your skin, and the door opened inward. The room beyond was small, circular, low-ceilinged, lit only by one small lantern suspended by a thin chain. There was a desk against the far wall, and upon it, books, dozens, all bound differently. Some in cracked leather, others in simple twine, a few wrapped in linen as if their pages were too fragile for covers. Their spines bore no titles, only marks, symbols, spirals, arcs, a few just fingerprints smudged into the cloth, and beside them stacked neatly in a wooden tray were blank pages. You approached, laid a hand upon the books. They pulsed faintly beneath your fingers, not with life but with readiness, like loaves just pulled from the hearth, still holding the warmth of their making. You pulled a chair from the corner and sat. For a while you just breathed. Then from your satchel you removed the last item you had never placed there, the flame, no longer burning, just a glow. Contained now within a small glass vial, its mouth sealed with wax and twine, its light still golden but softened. Waiting. You placed it beside the blank pages. You picked up a quill, and for the first time, your hand moved not from memory but from knowing. You began to write, not to explain, not to teach, to keep. The words flowed slowly, not like ink but like ash stirred gently back into embers. You wrote of the mirror that did not reflect, of the door behind the hearth, of the dogs who always knew, of the stare that turned sideways through time, of the figures who watched and never spoke until the silence asked for them. You wrote of the spindle, of the bowl, of the names never said aloud. You wrote until your hand ached and your eyes blurred. Then you stopped. You closed the book, wrapped it in cloth and placed it carefully among the others. It did not matter that no one had told you what to write. The tavern knew. You rose, returned to the door, paused once, hands still resting on the wood, and listened. Voices still murmuring. The dulcimer again. Footsteps above, the soft sigh of someone finally dreaming without fear. You opened the door and stepped back into the story. The door clicked shut behind you, soft as breath. The sound barely touched the room, but it left a ripple you could feel in the soles of your feet, like the pause before the first note of a remembered song. The tavern was dimmer now, not from fading light, but from deepening. The kind of hush that came when the fire had been tended, the chairs resettled, and the last mug drained to its dregs. It was the hour between stories, the space that held what had been spoken and what was still waiting. You moved slowly, the air around you warmer than before, closer. The fire still burned in the hearth, low and steady, casting light that no longer danced but pooled as if gathering itself for the night's end. The room smelled of ash and wood smoke, of wool warmed by skin, of parchment just turned. The traveller who had received the key now sat near the far wall. Their eyes were closed, the carving of the bird still in their lap. A small thread of sleep lined their features. Not the sleep of exhaustion, but of safety, the kind that visits only those who have come far enough to let go. Others remained nearby, scattered through the room. One leaned against the stairs post, tracing a faint pattern onto the wood. Another turned a mug slowly in both hands, watching the foam settle. None spoke. None needed to. The dulcimer sat on its stool again, resting now in silence, its strings still catching the light in fine lines. And the dog, now alone by the hearth, lifted its head as you passed, gave a quiet huff of recognition, then returned to its dreams. You walked to the centre of the room and stood there for a moment, the stone beneath your feet warm through your soles. This was the stillness you had always imagined existed somewhere. The kind you used to reach for between pages of a book. The silence beneath certain dreams. A pause in a stranger's story that felt like home. It lived here, and you were inside it. A soft knock echoed through the wood. Not the front door, not the stairs, from the floor. You turned toward the hearth. The stones beside it had shifted slightly. A narrow outline, subtle as a breath, marked the place where a trapdoor had been sealed. It was flush with the ground, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. But now it pulsed faintly, once, twice, as though remembering the touch of your footfalls from a long time ago. You crossed the room. Kneeling, you placed your hand upon the stone. Warm, but deeper than warmth, familiar. You pressed gently, and the trapdoor gave with a quiet exhale. It lifted on old hinges, revealing a stair beneath. Stone again, descending not into shadow, but into a low golden light that flickered faintly against the walls. You did not hesitate. You descended. Each step felt like memory, solid beneath your feet. The air below was still and cool, but not lifeless. It moved just slightly, the way breath moves in a body at rest. You could hear the faintest sound of running water, slow, shallow, like a stream beneath floorboards. It sang without melody, only rhythm. At the bottom, a chamber, round, stone, old. The ceiling arched in soft ribs like the inside of a cathedral carved from earth. Along the walls sat alcoves, each holding a small flame in a glass bowl. They gave off no heat, only light, gentle, like starlight held in a shell. And at the centre of the chamber stood a well, not deep, its rim worn smooth by hands. You stepped closer, within, water, still, dark, clear. And beneath it, reflections, not of yourself, of faces, hundreds, some with eyes closed, some with mouths open mid-speech. None moving, just held like breath beneath the surface, each face familiar. Not from memory, but from something deeper. Recognition without origin. These were the ones who had come before, not just through the tavern, through the remembering, through the thread. You looked down and saw your own face join them, not above, not below, beside. You didn't flinch, you only watched. The reflection did not mimic you, it held still while you moved. Then it blinked once and smiled. You reached out, not to touch, but to offer, and from your palm, The last warmth of the flame, still housed within the glass vial, pulsed once more. It lifted, floated gently from your fingers, hovered above the well, then descended. The moment it touched the water, the chamber filled with silence so complete it rang. The reflections blinked out, all at once, and the well went dark. The flames in the glass bowls did not go out. They shifted. Now in each, a thread of colour, one gold, one red, one deep, unnameable blue, one green like moss after rain. You turned, and behind you the path back up waited, lit by the soft glow of the woven lights. The well no longer called to you. It had received what it needed, and given something in return. You didn't yet know what. But as you climbed the stairs again, back toward the hearth, the floor, the breath of the tavern knew you would carry it. And one night, much later, someone else would ask the same silent question you had just answered. And the tavern would show them the way. The stairs welcomed your return with the same quiet ease as your descent. Each step rose beneath you, not like stone, but like memory, familiar and steady, formed from the same stuff as old songs hummed under breath. When you reached the trapdoor, it closed behind you without a sound, settling once more into the floor as if it had never moved. The tavern above had shifted again, not in shape, but in atmosphere. The kind of change you feel first in your chest, like walking into a room just after someone has whispered a secret, and the air still holds it between its walls. The fire was lower now, reduced to coals and quiet flame, but it still glowed with purpose. It did not flicker in uncertainty. It pulsed like the steady beat of a resting heart. Around it the others remained, though some now slept, wrapped in cloaks, arms folded under heads, boots untied, and limbs slack with peace. No one spoke, but every breath in the room moved together. As you stepped back into the circle of firelight, a figure at the far edge opened their eyes. An elder, face-lined and beautiful in the way stone becomes beautiful after 1,000 winters. They sat straight-backed, hands folded in their lap, their gaze warm but unwavering. You nodded to them, and they returned the gesture, as if they had been waiting only for that. Then they stood. They walked to the fire and reached for a small iron pot nestled in the embers. From it they drew a ladle of something thick and fragrant, stew, or broth, or tea so old it had become all three. They poured it into a wooden bowl and set it gently on the table beside them. Without words they gestured. You understood. You approached and took the bowl. The warmth of it seeped into your hands and up your arms, quieting something inside you that had not known it was still braced against the cold. You sipped. It tasted of root and spice and riverstone, of wood smoke and nettle, of something you had eaten once long ago after running barefoot through wet grass beneath stars. You drank deeply. And as you did, the quiet in the room grew softer still, not thinner but deeper, like a blanket settling over a shoulder or a thought that sinks into its proper place. When the bowl was empty, the elder took it from your hands, wiped its rim with a cloth, and returned it to the pot without a word. Then they looked at you again, not for answers, but in knowing. They stepped past you, toward the door, not the hidden one, nor the entrance, but a small door near the back, one that had never opened before. It was narrow, made of light-coloured wood, with no lock and no sigil. Just a single knot in the grain, right in its centre, shaped like an eye gently closed. They opened it. Behind was not another room. It was a stair, winding and narrow, lit from above by a light not golden, not silver, but soft and opaline, like mist catching morning before it turns to day. They turned back toward the fire and nodded. One by one, those who remained awake stood. The sleeping stirred slowly, as if responding to a call that hadn't been spoken but had already reached their bones. You stepped aside, and they began to ascend. Each figure moved with the grace of acceptance, not urgency. No one rushed. Some carried objects, bundles, books, small tokens pressed to hearts. Others carried nothing but their steps. One paused beside you and placed a hand on your shoulder. You didn't know them. You did. Then they too moved on. The elder waited until all had passed through the door, then looked back to you. You will remain, they said. Not as command, as truth. You nodded. They stepped through. And the door closed behind them. The tavern held its breath, and then exhaled. The fire flared gently once more. The wind outside whispered against the walls like an old friend, and you were alone, but not in loneliness. The hearth light wrapped around you, and the weight in your chest did not return. Instead, something lighter bloomed there, the sense not of having arrived, but of having become the place where others could. You turned to the shelves lining the wall near the fire. They were fuller now. The books, each one wrapped, marked, remembered, stood like sentinels of stories not just told, but tended. You reached for a blank page and laid it flat on the table, took up the quill again, and began the next entry, not from duty, not from task, but from something older, the quiet joy of keeping watch. The ink flowed smoothly onto the page, dark and steady, the quill guiding itself almost more than your hand. You weren't writing as a storyteller. Not anymore. These words were not performance, they were remembrance. You wrote slowly, not for lack of knowing, but because each word felt like a settling, a stone placed in a riverbed, a footstep in a land that would remember your tread long after you had moved on. This was not a tale for the reader, it was a tether. A map for those who would one day arrive through wind and silence and mist, empty-handed but full of echoes. Each line shaped the tavern anew, not with walls or beams, but with welcome, not with rooms, but with rest. And as you wrote, the fire beside you did not dim. It glowed brighter, just slightly, as though warmed by the act of being remembered. The pages filled, not quickly, but completely, with no need to cross out or rewrite. The ink never bled. The quill never scratched. There was no hurry, only presence. Eventually your hand came to a stop. The final line stood at the bottom of the page, quiet and patient. You read it back, not aloud, but with the voice behind your eyes. The one that had followed you through every door and stairwell, every glimmer of flame and shard of mirror. You closed the book, tied it shut with a simple loop of thread. You rose and slid it onto the shelf beside the others. As it settled into its place, the wooden boards beneath it shifted almost imperceptibly to make room. You could feel the tavern adjusting, breathing, folding the newest story into its walls like another beam, another brick. And then you stood still for a long while, not waiting, listening. The wind had changed. It moved differently against the windows now, not with searching, but with arrival. A moment passed, then another, and then a knock, gentle, hesitant, heard not just with ears, but with spine and skin. The sound of someone who had stood in the dark for a long time and finally found their way to the door. You turned, crossed the room. The firelight caught your shoulders, cast your shape tall across the floorboards. You passed the chairs, the dulcimer, the empty mugs. You opened the door, and there stood a child, not young in body but in presence, eyes wide, cloak damp, hands empty. Behind them, the wind stirred in gentle spirals, wrapping around their ankles, whispering encouragement. You met their gaze, and then you stepped aside. The child paused, crossed the threshold, and as they did, the air changed again. The hearth flared, the beams groaned softly. The walls leaned in just slightly, as if embracing the newest shape of the room. You closed the door behind them. Without a word, you offered a seat. They took it. You offered a cup. They held it carefully, and when they spoke, their voice was soft but sure. "I think I've been here before," they said. You smiled. "I know." They looked into the fire. You sat beside them. No questions, no stories. Not yet. Only warmth. Only time. The tavern watched, the night deepened, and another thread, silent and golden, began to weave itself into the quiet.